Captain Sarah Chen had been stationed at Ramstein Air Base for 18 months, and most people still thought she worked in logistics. The assumption wasn't entirely wrong. She did handle supply coordination for the 86th Airlift Wing. What they didn't know was that she also held a top-secret clearance and flew the most advanced F-16 Fighting Falcon in the European theater. The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual mix of coffee-fueled conversation and pre-mission tension. Sarah sat in the back row, her flight suit unremarkable among the dozen other pilots preparing for what command called a routine patrol mission along the Polish border. The reality was far more complex. Colonel Marcus Webb stood at the front of the room, his weathered face showing the strain of 3 decades in military aviation. "Intelligence indicates unusual activity from our eastern neighbors," he began, clicking through satellite images on the overhead display. 3 unidentified aircraft crossed into NATO airspace yesterday at 0600 hours. They turned back before we could intercept, but the pattern suggests reconnaissance. Sarah studied the flight paths on the screen. The aircraft had probed the border defenses at 3 different points, each approach designed to test response times and radar coverage. It was textbook preparation for something larger. Today's mission involves 4 aircraft, Webb continued. Call signs Viper 1 through 4. You'll maintain standard patrol altitude at 30,000 feet, covering sectors 7 through 12. Rules of engagement remain defensive unless directly threatened. Lieutenant Jake Morrison raised his hand from the front row. Sarah knew him by reputation, young, talented, and convinced that his academy training made him invincible. "Sir, what's our assessment of potential threats? Are we expecting the same unidentified aircraft? Unknown aircraft type, unknown capabilities," Webb replied. "Assume modern equipment and experienced pilots." Questions. Sarah remained silent. She'd read the classified briefings that these pilots hadn't seen. The unidentified aircraft were likely MiG-29 Fulcrums, upgraded versions with improved avionics and air-to-air missiles. The pilots flying them had trained extensively in Western tactics and wouldn't be caught off guard by standard NATO procedures. After the briefing, Sarah walked across the tarmac to her aircraft. Her F-16C looked identical to the others in the squadron, but beneath its standard exterior lay modifications that pushed the fighter far beyond its original specifications. Enhanced radar systems, upgraded electronic warfare capabilities, and weapons systems that officially didn't exist gave her aircraft capabilities that even her squadron mates couldn't imagine. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, her crew chief, finished his pre-flight inspection as she approached. "She's ready to go, Captain," he said, handing her the checklist. "All systems green, full fuel load, and the special package you requested." Sarah nodded, checking the weapons loadout. 4 AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, 2 AIM-9X Sidewinders, and a full load of 20mm cannon rounds. To outside observers, it was standard air-to-air configuration. They couldn't see the additional electronic warfare pod hidden in the aircraft's internal bay, or the experimental data link that connected her directly to satellite intelligence networks. "Rodriguez," she said quietly, "if anyone asks about my flight time, you don't know anything beyond what's in the public logs." The sergeant's expression didn't change. "Understood, ma'am," just like always. Sarah had accumulated over 2,800 hours in F-16 seconds, but only 400 hours appeared in her official records. The rest came from classified missions that never happened, training exercises that didn't exist, and combat operations in places that weren't on any map. She'd flown against advanced adversary aircraft, tested experimental tactics, and engaged targets that required the kind of precision that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. The other pilots in her formation didn't know any of this. To them, she was Captain Chen, the logistics officer who'd somehow qualified for flight duty. They assumed she was competent enough to maintain formation and follow orders, but they'd never seen her push an aircraft to its limits or execute maneuvers that redefined what they thought was possible. Lieutenant Morrison, flying as Viper 2, had made his opinion clear during earlier training flights. "It's good that they're giving support staff some flight experience," he'd told another pilot, unaware that Sarah was within earshot. "She keeps up well enough for someone who doesn't live and breathe this stuff." Sarah had said nothing. Her cover identity required that she appear skilled but not exceptional, competent but not threatening to the egos of pilots who'd never seen real combat. She flew conservative patterns, followed standard procedures, and let others take credit for successful exercises. It was a careful balance that had taken years to perfect. But today felt different. The intelligence reports, the border probes, and the unusual activity patterns all suggested something significant was developing. Sarah's specialized training and clearance level meant she understood threats that the regular squadron couldn't even imagine. She climbed into the cockpit, running through startup procedures that had become second nature. The F-16 systems came online with familiar efficiency, engine parameters normal, avionics functioning, weapon systems ready. She kept her radio chatter minimal as the formation prepared for takeoff. "Viper flight, this is Tower," came the voice through her headset. "You're cleared for takeoff. Runway 09er. Wind is light and variable. Visibility unlimited." The 4 F-16 seconds taxied into position. Sarah, flying as Viper 3 in the formation. Morrison led as Viper 1, with Captain Peters as 2 and Lieutenant Davis as 4. All three were solid pilots with good records, but none had experience beyond training exercises and routine patrols. "Viper flight, check in." Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. "Viper 2, ready." "Viper 3, ready," Sarah responded. "Viper 4, ready." "Tower Viper 1 requesting permission for formation takeoff." "Viper 1, cleared for takeoff." The F-16 seconds accelerated down the runway in perfect formation, their engines producing the characteristic roar that made ground crews step back and cover their ears. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft lifting off, the moment when tons of metal and fuel transformed into something that belonged in the sky. They climbed to patrol altitude, settling into a standard rectangular pattern that covered their assigned sectors. The flight was routine for the first hour radio checks, fuel consumption monitoring, and the careful attention to detail that kept military aviation safe. "Viper 1 to all aircraft," Morrison announced. "We're approaching the eastern boundary of Sector 9. Maintain altitude and spacing." Sarah checked her enhanced radar display, which showed significantly more information than the standard systems her flightmates used. 3 contacts appeared at the edge of detection range, flying in formation and heading directly toward the NATO border. Their flight profile and speed indicated military aircraft, possibly the same ones that had been probing defenses the day before. "Viper 1, this is 3, Sarah transmitted. "I'm picking up contacts bearing 085, approximately 60 miles out. 3 aircraft in formation." Morrison's voice carried surprise. 3. "I'm not seeing anything on radar." "Are you certain?" Sarah had to be careful. Her radar was more sensitive than the others, but she couldn't reveal that fact. "Contact is intermittent." 1. "They might be flying low or using electronic countermeasures." "All aircraft maintain patrol pattern," Morrison ordered. "I'm contacting base for guidance." While Morrison spoke with ground control, Sarah continued tracking the approaching aircraft. Their flight path would bring them across the border in approximately 12 minutes, and their formation suggested an intentional provocation rather than navigation error. 3 aircraft typically meant a standard intercept formation, 1 primary attacker with 2 supporting fighters. "Viper 1 to flight," Morrison announced after finishing his radio call. "Command confirms unidentified aircraft approaching our sector. We're authorized to intercept and escort them back across the border. Standard intercept procedures, no aggressive actions unless directly threatened." The 4 F-16 seconds turned toward the approaching contacts. But Sarah could see that Morrison's radar still wasn't detecting them clearly. The unidentified aircraft were using sophisticated electronic warfare techniques to mask their approach, technologies that the standard F-16 systems couldn't easily penetrate. "Viper 1, contacts bearing 090, now 40 miles and closing," Sarah reported. "Speed approximately 400 knots. "I've got intermittent returns," Morrison replied. "Peters, Davis, report your contacts." "Negative contact on radar," Peters responded. "Same here," Davis added. "Nothing solid." Sarah realized that her squadron mates were flying blind against adversaries who clearly understood NATO radar capabilities and had planned accordingly. The approaching aircraft would maintain their electronic advantage until the last moment, when visual identification became necessary. All aircraft, climb to Angels 35, Morrison ordered. We'll intercept from above and maintain altitude advantage. The formation climbed 5,000 feet, but Sarah knew that altitude alone wouldn't provide the advantage Morrison expected. The approaching aircraft were maintaining low altitude to avoid detection, and they'd likely pop up at the last moment to achieve tactical surprise. Viper 1, recommend we spread formation, Sarah suggested carefully. If they're using electronic warfare, we'll need multiple angles to maintain contact. -3. We maintain formation integrity. Standard NATO intercept doctrine. Sarah said nothing more, but privately wondered if standard doctrine would prove adequate against adversaries who had clearly studied and prepared for exactly those procedures. She maintained position in the formation while tracking the approaching contacts on her classified systems. The next few minutes would determine whether this remained a routine intercept or became something far more serious. Sarah's training told her to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, but her gut instinct suggested that 3 unidentified aircraft crossing the border weren't interested in peaceful resolution. She checked her weapons systems one final time, ensuring that everything was ready if the situation escalated. The other pilots in her formation had no idea that they were approaching what might become the most challenging air-to-air engagement in European airspace since the Cold War. And they had no idea that the quiet logistics officer flying as Viper 3 had been trained specifically for exactly this type of scenario. The first indication that this wouldn't be a routine intercept came when Sarah's enhanced radar showed the 3 contacts suddenly climbing rapidly from low altitude. They'd been flying nap of the Earth to avoid detection, but now they were ascending to engagement altitude with the aggressive climb rate of combat aircraft preparing for action. Viper 1. Contacts are climbing rapidly, Sarah announced. Bearing 095. Altitude passing through 20,000 feet. And climbing. Morrison's radar finally acquired solid returns as the aircraft rose above the electronic interference zone they'd been using for concealment. Contact confirmed. 3 aircraft, now bearing 098. All Vipers. Maintain formation and prepare for standard intercept. Sarah watched her display as the 3 aircraft, now clearly identifiable as MiG-29 Fulcrums, continued their aggressive climb. Their flight profile indicated experienced pilots who understood they'd lost the element of surprise and were transitioning to Plan B. Whatever Plan B was, it wouldn't involve peaceful escort across the border. Viper 1. Those are MiGs. 29 seconds. Peters called out, tension evident in his voice. They're not responding to radio calls. Continue intercept pattern, Morrison replied, but Sarah could hear uncertainty creeping into his transmission. Academy training covered intercept procedures, but it didn't adequately prepare pilots for adversaries who refused to follow the script. The MiGs leveled off at 32,000 feet, putting them slightly below the F-16 formation. Sarah's tactical analysis indicated this was deliberate. The MiG pilots wanted the American aircraft to maintain altitude advantage while they executed their real plan. That's when her extended radar coverage detected the second group. 4 additional contacts were approaching from the northeast, flying a course designed to catch the F-16 formation between 2 enemy elements. They were still 60 miles out, but closing fast. The original 3 MiGs weren't the primary threat, they were bait to position the NATO fighters for attack by the second group. Sarah faced a critical decision. Revealing the approaching aircraft would expose her enhanced radar capabilities, but not revealing them would likely result in her squadron flying into a trap that could get them all killed. Viper 1, this is 3, she transmitted. I'm detecting additional contacts, bearing 045, approximately 60 miles northeast of our position. 4 aircraft in formation. Negative contact, 3, Morrison replied. Are you certain? Positive contact. Increasing in strength. They appear to be timing their approach to coincide with our engagement of the first group. There was a pause as Morrison processed this information. Standard doctrine didn't account for complex multi-element attacks, and his training hadn't prepared him for an adversary sophisticated enough to execute coordinated maneuvers. All Vipers, extend formation, Morrison finally ordered. We may be facing a larger threat than anticipated. The 4 F-16 seconds spread out, but Sarah could see they were still thinking in terms of traditional intercept procedures. The approaching MiGs weren't planning to turn around when confronted by NATO fighters. They were planning to eliminate those fighters. Viper 1. Request permission to take defensive positioning, Sarah transmitted. Negative. 3. Maintain formation. Sarah watched the tactical situation develop with growing concern. The first group of MiGs was now leveling off just below the F-16 seconds, while the second group had accelerated and would arrive in approximately 8 minutes. Her squadron mates still didn't fully grasp the danger they were facing. The MiG pilots made the situation clear when they suddenly broke formation and began aggressive maneuvering. Instead of maintaining course or turning away, they pulled into climbing turns that brought them directly toward the American aircraft. Viper flight, we have hostile actions, Morrison announced, his voice tight with adrenaline. MiGs are maneuvering aggressively. All aircraft, prepare for defensive actions. Sarah saw the lead MiG lock onto Morrison's aircraft with its radar. The distinctive electronic signature appeared on her threat warning system, indicating that the enemy pilot was preparing to launch an air-to-air missile. Viper 1, you're spiked, Sarah called out, using the aviation term for radar lock. Brake left now. Morrison immediately pulled his aircraft into a hard left turn, but the MiG pilot had anticipated the maneuver. The enemy aircraft adjusted its approach, maintaining radar lock while closing to optimal missile range. Sarah made a split-second decision that would expose her true capabilities but might save Morrison's life. She rolled her F-16 into an aggressive diving turn that brought her between the MiG and Morrison's aircraft, then activated electronic countermeasures that her squadron mates didn't know existed. The MiG's radar lock broke as Sarah's electronic warfare systems overwhelmed its guidance computers. The enemy pilot, suddenly finding his primary target obscured by advanced jamming, was forced to choose between continuing his attack on Morrison or engaging the F-16 that had just revealed sophisticated capabilities. He chose Sarah. The MiG pulled hard right and rolled inverted, diving toward Sarah's aircraft with the speed and precision of a pilot who had trained extensively for air-to-air combat. Sarah watched his approach vector on her display and realized she was facing someone with experience far beyond what intelligence reports had suggested. Viper 3 is engaged, Sarah announced calmly, pulling her aircraft into a vertical climb that pushed the F-16's airframe to maximum stress limits. Viper 1. Take the lead, MiG. Viper 2 and 4. Watch for the second group. Morrison's voice came back strained but focused. 3. Where did you learn to fly like that? Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy executing a maneuver that theoretically shouldn't work against a MiG-29's superior thrust-to-weight ratio. But theory didn't account for the specific modifications to her aircraft or the thousands of hours she'd spent training against similar adversaries. The MiG pilot followed her into the vertical climb, expecting the heavier F-16 to bleed energy and fall back into his engagement envelope. Instead, Sarah's modified aircraft maintained climb rate while she waited for the optimal moment to reverse. At 15,000 feet above their starting altitude, Sarah snapped the F-16 over the top and rolled into a diving turn that brought her nose around toward the MiG's 6 o'clock position. The enemy pilot, committed to his own climb and unable to match her maneuver, suddenly found himself defensive. Fox 2, Sarah called, launching an AIM-9X Sidewinder missile from optimal range. The MiG pilot immediately deployed countermeasures chaff and flares designed to confuse the missile's guidance system. But the AIM-9X was specifically designed to defeat such countermeasures, and Sarah had launched from a position that gave the missile the best possible approach angle. The Sidewinder impacted the MiG's left engine intake, detonating its warhead in a bright flash that tore through the aircraft's fuel systems. The enemy fighter began trailing fire and smoke as its pilots struggled to maintain control. Splash 1, Sarah reported, watching the damaged MiG begin an emergency descent. Viper 3. What the hell was that maneuver? Peters asked over the radio. Sarah didn't have time to explain. Her enhanced radar showed the second group of MiGs had closed to 40 miles and were now climbing to engagement altitude. Worse, they'd split into two elements, two aircraft approaching from the northeast and two more coming from the east. Her squadron was about to be outnumbered 7-4, assuming the remaining aircraft from the first group were still combat effective. All Vipers. We have multiple contacts inbound, Sarah announced. 4 aircraft from the northeast, approximately 35 miles. They've split formation. Morrison was still engaged with the second MiG from the original group, executing basic defensive maneuvers but clearly struggling against an opponent with superior training. Peters and Davis had moved to intercept the third aircraft, but their standard tactical approach was proving inadequate against an enemy pilot who refused to follow NATO expectations. Sarah realized that her squadron mates were fighting the air war they'd trained for, while the enemy was fighting the air war that actually existed. The MiG pilots had studied Western tactics and prepared specifically to counter them. They knew how NATO pilots thought, how they moved, and what mistakes they typically made under pressure. But they hadn't prepared for Sarah. She rolled her F-16 toward Morrison's position, where he was locked in a turning fight that favored the MiG's superior maneuverability. The enemy pilot was patient, waiting for Morrison to make the error that would put him in a vulnerable position. Sarah approached the engagement from an angle the MiG pilot couldn't easily detect, using terrain masking and electronic warfare to conceal her approach. When she was within 20 miles, she activated systems that her squadron mates had never seen. Advanced radar modes that could track multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining stealth characteristics. Viper 1, break high on my mark, she transmitted to Morrison. 3, I don't see you on my scope. Trust me. Break high. In 3, 2, 1. His mark. Morrison pulled his aircraft into a climbing turn just as Sarah's F-16 appeared on the MiG's radar screen. The enemy pilot, suddenly finding himself between two American aircraft, was forced to choose his priority target. He chose wrong. The MiG pilot turned toward Sarah, assuming she represented the lesser threat based on her previous conservative flying. But Sarah wasn't flying conservatively anymore. She was flying like someone who had trained against the world's most advanced fighter aircraft and learned to win. Sarah's approach put the MiG in what pilots call the death spiral, a position where any maneuver the enemy made would only worsen his tactical situation. If he turned toward Sarah, Morrison could attack from behind. If he maintained course toward Morrison, Sarah could attack from the side. If he attempted to disengage, both American pilots could pursue. The MiG pilot realized his mistake and attempted to extend out of the engagement, pushing his aircraft to maximum speed in an effort to create separation. But Sarah had anticipated the move. Fox 3, she called, launching an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile from beyond visual range. The advanced missile streaked toward the fleeing MiG, its active radar guidance system immune to the electronic countermeasures the enemy pilot deployed. The MiG's radar warning receiver would be screaming missile launch warnings, but at his current speed and altitude, evasive maneuvers were limited. The AMRAAM impacted the MiG's fuselage just aft of the cockpit, its warhead designed to maximize damage to critical aircraft systems. The enemy fighter disintegrated in a cloud of debris that scattered across several square miles of airspace. Splash 2, Sarah reported, but there was no time to celebrate. The second group of MiGs had closed to 20 miles, and her radar showed them executing a complex attack pattern that would put the remaining F-16 seconds at serious disadvantage. Peters and Davis were still struggling with the third aircraft from the original group, while Morrison was trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Viper Flight, this is 3, Sarah announced. We're facing coordinated attack by multiple aircraft with advanced training. Request permission to take tactical control. There was a pause before Morrison responded. 3. You have tactical control. All aircraft comply with Viper 3's instructions. Sarah quickly analyzed the developing situation. 4 fresh MiGs were approaching in a complex attack pattern, while one damaged aircraft from the first group was still maneuvering defensively against Peters and Davis. The enemy pilots clearly intended to overwhelm the American formation through superior numbers and coordination. But Sarah had faced similar odds before, in training exercises that never appeared in official records. She knew that defeating multiple adversaries required turning their coordination against them. Viper 2 and 4, "Disengage and climb to Angels 4-0, she ordered. Viper 1, extend southwest and prepare for coordinated attack. 3. Those are unusual tactics, Morrison replied. Trust me, Sarah said simply. She pulled her F-16 into a steep climb, while simultaneously activating electronic warfare systems that would make her aircraft appear larger and more threatening on enemy radar screens. The approaching MiGs would see what appeared to be a heavy fighter climbing to attack altitude, exactly the kind of threat that demanded their immediate attention. The deception worked. 3 of the 4 approaching MiGs turned toward Sarah's aircraft, leaving only one to pursue Morrison. The enemy pilots thought they were converging on an isolated F-16 that would be easy prey for multiple attackers. They were about to learn otherwise. As the 3 MiGs closed to within 10 miles, Sarah executed a maneuver that few pilots would attempt, and fewer still could survive. She snapped her aircraft inverted and pulled through a -G dive that brought her nose toward the lead MiG, while simultaneously deploying chaff and flares to confuse their targeting systems. Fox 2, she called, launching her remaining Sidewinder at the lead aircraft. The missile struck home, but Sarah was already maneuvering toward the second MiG, using her aircraft's momentum to execute a high-speed passing shot that put her in position for a gun's attack. The F-16's 20mm cannon erupted in a stream of high-explosive rounds that walked across the second MiG's wing root and engine bay. The enemy aircraft immediately began trailing smoke and lost altitude rapidly. Splash 3, Sarah reported, even as she rolled to evade fire from the third MiG. The remaining enemy pilot was good, better than the others. He'd recognized that Sarah wasn't a typical NATO pilot and adjusted his tactics accordingly. Instead of pressing a direct attack, he was maneuvering to force her into a position where his wingman could engage from beyond visual range. Sarah realized that the fourth MiG, the one that had initially ignored her, was positioning for a missile shot. She was about to be caught between 2 experienced adversaries in a tactical situation that favored the enemy. That's when her training at Nellis Air Force Base paid off. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours flying against the 64th Aggressor Squadron, pilots who specialized in replicating enemy tactics and pushing American aviators beyond their limits. She'd learned to fight outnumbered and win. Sarah rolled her F-16 toward the nearest threat and activated her final electronic warfare countermeasure, a system that sent false target information to enemy radar systems. Both MiGs suddenly found their screens cluttered with multiple contacts, making it impossible to determine which target was real. In the confusion, Sarah accelerated toward the nearer MiG and fired her last AMRAAM at point-blank range. The missile had barely enough time to arm before impact, but it didn't need time to guide at that range. It was effectively a very expensive cannon round. Splash 4, Sarah announced as the final MiG from the second group broke apart under the missile's impact. The remaining aircraft, recognizing that its wingman was gone and that it was facing an opponent far more dangerous than intelligence had suggested, turned east and accelerated toward home territory. Sarah let it go. Her ammunition was exhausted, and pursuing a single fleeing enemy wasn't worth the risk. The entire engagement had lasted less than 12 minutes. In that time, Sarah had eliminated 4 MiG-29 fulcrums and fundamentally changed her squadron mates' understanding of air-to-air combat. Viper flight, sound off, Morrison called. Viper 2, green, Peters replied, his voice shaky. Viper 4, green, Davis added. Viper 3, green, ammunition expended. There was a long pause before Morrison spoke again. Viper 3, who the hell are you? Sarah keyed her radio one final time before they turned toward home. Viper flight. This is 3. We need to maintain radio silence regarding specific engagement details until debrief. Standard operational security protocols apply. The flight back to Ramstein was conducted in an unusual quiet, broken only by necessary navigation calls and fuel checks. Sarah could imagine the questions building in her squadron mates' minds, but military discipline and her direct instruction kept the radio traffic professional. She used the 40-minute flight time to consider how much she could reveal during the inevitable debriefing. Her cover identity had been blown the moment she executed maneuvers that no logistics officer should know, but the extent of her true background remained classified at levels that even base command didn't have access to. Ramstein Tower, Viper flight requesting immediate landing, 4 aircraft, Morrison transmitted as they approached the base. Viper flight, you're cleared for immediate approach runway 09er. emergency vehicles standing by as precautionary measure. Sarah wondered what the tower operators were thinking. The flight had departed for routine patrol and was returning with emergency protocols activated. Word would already be spreading through the base that something significant had occurred. The 4 F-16 seconds touched down in sequence, their drag chutes deploying normally despite the afternoon's extraordinary events. As Sarah taxied toward her assigned parking spot, she could see that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting with several other maintenance crew members. Their expressions suggested they'd already heard unofficial reports about the mission. Sarah shut down her aircraft and completed the standard post-flight checklist, though her mind was already moving toward the conversations that would begin the moment she stepped out of the cockpit. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the debriefing began, and those 10 minutes would determine how much of her real story she could keep classified. She climbed down from the cockpit to find Rodriguez approaching with his usual post-flight inspection clipboard. But his expression was different. Instead of the routine professionalism she'd grown accustomed to, she saw something that looked like recognition. "Outstanding flying today, Captain," Rodriguez said quietly. "Just like Nellis. Except this time, it was real." Sarah paused, her helmet bag halfway to her shoulder. "Sergeant, I'm not sure what you mean." Rodriguez smiled slightly. "Ma'am, I was crew chief for the 64th Aggressor Squadron for 6 years before transferring here. I worked on your aircraft during Red Flag 17-3. You might not remember me, but I remember that F-16 and the pilot who could make it do things that weren't in the manual." The recognition hit Sarah immediately. Rodriguez had been part of the ground crew during one of her most intensive training periods. When she'd been preparing for missions that officially didn't exist, he'd watched her push aircraft beyond their design specifications and had maintained the modifications that made such performance possible. "Rodriguez, that information is classified." "Yes, ma'am. I signed the same papers you did. But seeing you today, flying like that against real adversaries." He shook his head admiringly. "That was something special." Before Sarah could respond further, she saw Colonel Webb approaching across the flight line, accompanied by 2 men in civilian clothes who had the unmistakable bearing of intelligence officers. The debriefing was about to become far more complex than a standard mission report. "Captain Chen," Webb called out, "we need to talk. Conference room A immediately." Sarah grabbed her gear and followed the group toward the building, passing Morrison, Peters, and Davis as they completed their own post-flight procedures. Morrison caught her eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that suggested respect but also confusion about what he'd witnessed. Conference room A was typically used for routine briefings, but today it had been converted into something resembling a formal investigation. Additional personnel were present, including Major Sandra Walsh from the 86th Operations Group and Captain Eric Thompson from Intelligence. The 2 civilian officials introduced themselves as Mr. Davidson and Miss Park from an agency they didn't name. "Captain Chen," Colonel Webb began, "we need a complete account of today's engagement. Start from initial contact and include every detail you remember." Sarah spent the next 40 minutes providing a thorough tactical description of the aerial engagement, carefully omitting any reference to her enhanced systems or classification-level training. She described the enemy aircraft behavior, the engagement sequence, and the weapons employment that resulted in 4 confirmed kills. When she finished, the room remained quiet for several moments. "Captain," Miss Park spoke for the first time, "your account describes maneuvers and tactical decisions that suggest training and experience well beyond what appears in your official records. Can you explain that discrepancy?" Sarah had prepared for this question during the flight home. "Ma'am, I've always been interested in aviation and have spent considerable personal time studying advanced tactics. I've also participated in additional training opportunities when my logistics duties permitted." Mr. Davidson leaned forward. "Captain, we're going to need more specifics. The electronic warfare techniques you employed today are not covered in standard F-16 training curricula. Your weapons employment patterns suggest familiarity with classified engagement protocols." The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah could continue the fiction that she was simply a well-trained pilot who had performed exceptionally under pressure. Or she could acknowledge that her background was more complex than her cover identity suggested. Colonel Webb made the decision for her. "Gentlemen, Miss Park," he said firmly, I think it's time we discussed Captain Chen's actual assignment here at Ramstein. The intelligence officers exchanged glances before Mr. Davidson nodded. Colonel, we'll need the room cleared, except for essential personnel. Major Walsh and Captain Thompson were asked to leave, leaving only Sarah, Colonel Webb, and the two intelligence officers. Webb activated an electronic device that would prevent surveillance of their conversation. Captain Chen, Miss Park began, your cover assignment as logistics officer has been effective, but today's events require us to discuss your primary mission. How much have you told your squadron mates? Nothing beyond what was necessary to complete the mission, Sarah replied. They know I have capabilities beyond what they expected, but they don't know the source or extent of those capabilities. Mr. Davidson consulted a classified folder. Your record shows 2,847 total flight hours in F-16 variants, including 847 hours in adversary training and 623 hours in classified operational missions. You've flown against Russian, Chinese, and Allied aircraft under controlled conditions designed to assess their capabilities and develop countering tactics. Sarah nodded. This was the background she'd expected them to eventually discover, though she hoped it would remain classified longer. Your aircraft, Miss Park continued, contains electronic warfare and radar systems that are approximately 18 months ahead of standard F-16 capabilities. Today's engagement provided the first operational test of those systems against advanced adversary aircraft. And they performed exactly as expected, Sarah replied. The modifications proved effective against MiG-29 radar and countermeasures. Colonel Webb spoke up. Captain, the problem we now face is that your squadron mates witnessed flying that they can't explain with standard training. Lieutenant Morrison has already submitted questions about your tactical knowledge, and Captains Peters and Davis are asking how logistics personnel learned advanced air-to-air combat techniques. Sarah understood the complexity of the situation. Her cover identity had been necessary to operate at Ramstein without drawing attention, but maintaining that cover after today's performance would be impossible. Sir, what are my options? She asked. Mr. Davidson answered. We have several possibilities. First, we could transfer you to another assignment, where your capabilities would be more appropriate to your cover identity. Second, we could modify your official records to reflect additional training that would explain today's performance. Third, we could brief your squadron mates to a limited extent about your actual background. What would you recommend? Sarah asked. Miss Park leaned back in her chair. Honestly, Captain, your performance today exceeded all expectations. You faced 4 advanced aircraft with pilots trained specifically to counter NATO tactics, and you eliminated them without losing a single friendly aircraft. That's the kind of result that justifies revealing capabilities we'd prefer to keep classified. Colonel Webb nodded agreement. Sarah, I've known about your assignment here since you arrived. What I didn't know was exactly how capable you really are. Your squadron mates flew with someone today who probably saved their lives. They deserve to know they were flying with one of the Air Force's most skilled pilots. Sarah considered the implications. Revealing her true background would end her assignment at Ramstein and likely transfer her to a unit where her skills were publicly acknowledged. But it would also provide closure for pilots who had witnessed something they couldn't understand. If we brief Morrison, Peters, and Davis, she asked, how much do they need to know? They need to know that you're a test pilot with advanced training, assigned here to evaluate new systems under operational conditions. Mr. Davidson replied. They need to know that today's mission provided exactly the kind of real-world test data that justifies the entire program. And they need to know that what they witnessed is classified. What about the aircraft modifications? Sarah asked. Those remain classified, Miss Park said firmly. As far as your squadron mates know, you're flying a standard F-16 with exceptional skill. The electronic warfare capabilities you displayed today can be explained as superior pilot technique rather than superior equipment. 2 hours later, Sarah found herself back in conference room A, this time with Morrison, Peters, and Davis present. Colonel Webb had briefed them about the classified nature of the discussion and the consequences of violating security protocols. Gentlemen, Webb began, Captain Chen's assignment here has been more complex than her logistics duties suggested. She's a test pilot with the 412th Test Wing, temporarily assigned to Ramstein to evaluate pilot performance under European operational conditions. Morrison spoke first. Sir, that explains the flying, but not the tactical knowledge. Captain Chen knew enemy aircraft positions before our radars could detect them, and she understood their attack patterns better than pilots with combat experience. Sarah decided to provide a partial explanation. Lieutenant, I've spent the last 3 years flying against adversary aircraft that replicate foreign capabilities. I've learned to recognize flight patterns, electronic warfare techniques, and tactical approaches used by potential adversaries. Today's engagement followed patterns I'd seen during training exercises. What kind of training exercises? Peters asked. The kind that prepare American pilots to face advanced threats, Sarah replied. The kind that remain classified, because revealing their existence would compromise their effectiveness. Davis leaned forward. Captain, I saw you execute maneuvers that I didn't think were possible in an F-16. How do you explain that? Extensive training and detailed knowledge of aircraft limitations, Sarah answered. When you understand exactly what an aircraft can do, you can push it closer to those limits safely. Morrison was quiet for several moments before speaking again. Captain, I want to apologize for my earlier comments about support staff flight experience. I clearly had no idea who I was talking to. No apology necessary, Sarah replied. My cover assignment was designed to prevent exactly the kind of attention that could compromise mission effectiveness. Colonel Webb wrapped up the session with a reminder about classification levels and a warning about discussing the day's events outside of official channels. But as the pilots filed out of the conference room, Sarah could see that their understanding of her had fundamentally changed. 3 days later, Sarah received orders transferring her to Edwards Air Force Base, where her test pilot background would be openly acknowledged and her advanced training could be fully utilized. The cover assignment at Ramstein had served its purpose, providing operational testing for systems that would eventually be deployed fleet-wide. On her final day at the base, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached her aircraft one last time. Captain, it's been an honor working with you, he said. I hope whoever gets assigned this aircraft next appreciates what they're flying. Rodriguez, Sarah replied. Make sure they understand that the aircraft is only as good as the pilot flying it. What happened the other day wasn't about advanced technology. It was about training, preparation, and the willingness to push beyond what people think is possible. Lieutenant Morrison appeared as she finished her final inspection. Captain Chen, I wanted to thank you personally. What you did the other day probably saved all our lives. Sarah shook his hand. Lieutenant, you would have found a way to succeed with or without me. Good pilots adapt to changing situations. Great pilots prepare for situations that haven't happened yet. As her transport aircraft lifted off from Ramstein, Sarah reflected on the 18 months she'd spent maintaining her cover identity. The logistics assignment had provided perfect concealment for her real mission, but it had also taught her something about the value of appearing unremarkable while preparing for remarkable challenges. The 4 MiG-29 pilots she'd faced had been skilled and well-trained, but they'd prepared to fight the American pilots they expected to encounter. They hadn't prepared to face someone who had trained specifically to exceed those expectations. Sarah's next assignment would be different. At Edwards, her capabilities would be acknowledged and utilized openly, but she would always remember the lesson learned at Ramstein. Sometimes, the most dangerous opponent is the one who doesn't look dangerous at all. The transport aircraft climbed into the afternoon sky, carrying Captain Sarah Chen toward her next mission, and leaving behind a squadron of pilots who would never again underestimate the quiet professionalism that often conceals extraordinary capability.